So, I've actually got two stories that I think are worth hearing, and they're both related to each other in a way that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. My name is Alex. I used to work late nights at a gas station/convenience store out in rural Pennsylvania. This was about 6 years ago, which I'm only mentioning because it was back before every establishment had state-of-the-art security systems and cameras covering every square inch of their property. It's not like security systems didn't exist, more so that it wasn't much of a priority for places like this. Plus, the owner was incredibly cheap. But anyway, I didn't care because the job was laughably easy. The most difficult part of working there was honestly the isolation and the boredom. Story 1, the regular customer. Here's everything you need to know. Most nights it was just me in there from 10 p.m. to 6 o'clock in the morning, and the place didn't see much traffic. Maybe 10 customers on a busy night. That's about it. Anyway, one night, I'm pretty sure it was a Thursday, I was doing what I always did, leaning against the counter scrolling through my phone, trying to prevent the boredom from putting me to sleep. It was really late. I don't remember exactly what time it was, since the store had the remarkable ability to blend all the ungodly hours of the night into one lump of misery. But the store was dead silent. You know, that faint buzzing noise those old fluorescent lights make? That was the only noise I'd hear for hours, and my brain had gotten numb to it, which I guess explains why I was so startled when the front door chimed. I looked up and there was a man walking in. He was probably in his mid-40s, average height, wearing work clothes like he'd just gotten off a construction site or something. Nothing immediately stood out about him. He gave me a little nod as he walked past the counter toward the back of the store where the coolers were. I nodded back and went back to my phone. This is important context. We had maybe 5 or 6 regulars who came in during my shift. Guys who worked night shifts at factories or warehouses, people heading home from late shifts at hospitals, that sort of thing. I knew their faces, knew what they usually bought, knew their routines. This guy wasn't a regular. I'd never seen him before. He spent maybe 5 minutes browsing the aisles, which was already kind of weird. Most people who come into a gas station at 2 a.m. know exactly what they want. They grab it and leave. They don't browse. Eventually, he came up to the counter with a coffee and a pack of beef jerky. Standard stuff. I rang him up, told him the total, and he paid in cash. But here's where it got weird. As I was counting out his change, he just stood there staring at me. Not in an aggressive way, but in this really intense, focused way that made me uncomfortable. I handed him his change and said, "Have a good night." He didn't move. He just kept staring at me with this slight smile on his face. "Is there something else I can help you with?" I asked, trying to sound polite but firm. "You work here every night?" he asked. "Most nights," I said. I didn't want to give him my exact schedule. He nodded slowly, like he was processing this information. "You ever get scared? Being here all alone?" The question caught me off guard. "Not really," I lied. "It's pretty quiet." He smiled wider. "Yeah, quiet. That's good." Then he picked up his coffee and jerky and walked out. The door chimed and he was gone. I stood there for a minute, trying to shake off the weird feeling the interaction had given me. Something about the way he asked that question, the way he smiled, just felt wrong. I went back to my phone and tried to forget about it. About 2 weeks later, he came in again. Same time, around 2 a.m. Same routine. Browsed for a few minutes, bought coffee and beef jerky, stood at the counter staring at me. This time, he asked me my name. I hesitated. "Alex," I said finally. "Alex," he repeated, like he was testing how it sounded. "That's a nice name. You go to school, Alex?" "Yeah," I said, keeping my answers short. I didn't want to engage in conversation with this guy. "What are you studying?" "Business." He nodded. "Smart. You planning to work here after you graduate?" "Probably not," I said with a forced laugh. He smiled again. "Good. You seem like you're meant for better things." The way he said it made my stomach turn. It wasn't a compliment. It was something else. Something that felt predatory. He left after that, and I immediately felt relieved. Over the next month, he came in 6 more times. Always around 2 a.m. Always bought the same thing. Always asked me personal questions. Where did I live? Did I have a girlfriend? What kind of car did I drive? Did I walk to work or drive? I started lying to him. Made up vague answers that didn't give away any real information. But he kept coming back, kept asking questions, kept staring at me with that smile. I mentioned it to my manager during one of our shift changes. She told me to just be polite and not engage too much. Some people are just lonely, she said. They come in here for the company. But this didn't feel like loneliness. This felt like something else. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night. I was restocking shelves around 3 a.m. when the door chimed. I looked up and saw him walking in. But this time, he had someone with him. Another man, younger, maybe in his 20s. They were talking quietly as they walked toward the back of the store. I went back behind the counter and watched them through the security mirror. They were standing by the coolers, not actually looking at anything, just talking. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but every few seconds, the older guy would glance toward the counter. Toward me. Then the younger guy looked too. And they both just stared at me for a few seconds before going back to their conversation. My heart started pounding. Something was very wrong. They spent maybe 10 minutes in the store, way longer than usual, before finally coming up to the counter. The older guy bought his usual coffee and jerky. The younger guy didn't buy anything. As I was ringing up the older guy, he said, "This is my nephew, Tyler. Tyler, this is Alex. The one I was telling you about." The younger guy smiled at me. "Nice to meet you." I forced a smile back. "You too." "Alex works here all alone," the older guy said to Tyler. "Every night. Just him." Tyler nodded, looking around the store. "Must get pretty quiet." "It does," I said, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. The older guy paid and they both just stood there for a moment, looking at me. "Well," the older guy said finally. "We'll see you around, Alex." They left. I immediately locked the door behind them, even though I wasn't supposed to lock it until 6 a.m. I called my manager and told her I was closing early because I felt sick. She wasn't happy about it, but I didn't care. I got in my car and drove home, checking my rearview mirror the entire way. The older guy came in one more time after that. This was maybe a week later. I was on high alert the whole shift, and when he walked in, I was ready. He didn't browse this time. He walked straight up to the counter. "Where were you last week?" he asked. "I came in and you weren't here." "I had the night off," I lied. He frowned. "You usually work Tuesdays." "Not every Tuesday," I said, trying to sound casual. He stared at me for a long moment. "You seem nervous, Alex. Everything okay?" "I'm fine." "You sure? You're acting different." "I'm fine," I repeated, more firmly this time. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Okay. If you say so." He bought his coffee and jerky and left. I watched him walk to his car through the window. He sat in his car for maybe 5 minutes, just sitting there, before finally driving away. I quit 2 days later. Told my manager I got a better job offer, which was a lie. I just couldn't work there anymore. I couldn't deal with that guy coming in, asking questions, bringing his nephew, watching me. I never found out what he wanted or what his intentions were. Maybe he really was just lonely. Maybe he was harmless. But I don't think so. I think something bad would have happened if I'd kept working there. I think I got out just in time. Story 2, the photograph. Okay, if you thought that was unsettling, this next one is worse. And it's connected to the first story in a way that still doesn't make sense to me. About 3 months after I quit that gas station job, I was working at a different place. A truck stop about 40 miles away from the first location. Different company, different area, but same type of work. Late night shifts, mostly alone. I figured I was far enough away that I wouldn't run into the same problems. And for the first month, everything was fine. Normal customers, no issues. Then one night, this guy walks in. He was probably in his 50s, wearing an expensive-looking leather jacket and jeans. He had this air about him that immediately put me on edge. He looked like someone who was used to getting what he wanted. He didn't browse. He walked straight up to the counter and looked at me for a moment, like he was studying my face. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph. He placed it on the counter and slid it toward me. "You recognize this person?" he asked. His voice was deep and rough, like a smoker's voice. I looked down at the photo. My blood ran cold. It was the older guy from my previous job. The one who'd been coming in, asking questions, making me uncomfortable. The photo looked like it was taken from a distance, like surveillance footage or something. The guy was getting into a car, and his face was clearly visible. "Why are you asking me this?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just answer the question. Have you seen this man before?" I could have lied. Part of me wanted to lie. But something about this guy made me think lying would be a bad idea. "Yeah," I said. "He used to come into the gas station where I worked before." "Why?" The man's expression didn't change. When was the last time you saw him? About 3 months ago. Right before I quit. He ever say anything to you? Ask you any questions? I hesitated. He asked me a lot of questions. About my schedule, where I lived, stuff like that. It made me uncomfortable. That's part of why I quit. The man nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he already suspected. Did he ever come in with anyone else? One time, I said. He brought his nephew. At least, that's who he said it was. What did this nephew look like? I described the younger guy as best I could remember. The man in the leather jacket listened intently, then reached into his jacket again and pulled out another photo. This him? He asked, sliding the second photo toward me. It was the younger guy. Same face. But in this photo, he was somewhere else, somewhere that looked like a parking lot. Yeah, I said. That's him. Who are these people? What's going on? The man picked up both photos and put them back in his jacket. You don't want to know, he said. Are you a cop? I asked. He smiled slightly. No, I'm not a cop. Then who are you? Someone who's looking for these men. And I suggest you forget you ever saw them. Don't talk to anyone about this. Don't mention it to anyone. Understand? I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. He stared at me for another moment, like he was deciding whether to believe me. Then he turned and walked toward the door. Right before he left, he stopped and looked back at me. If either of those men ever contact you again, he said, you call this number immediately. He pulled out a business card and placed it on the counter. It was blank except for a phone number. No name, no company, nothing else. Then he was gone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the business card. My hands were shaking. I kept the card, put it in my wallet and tried to forget about the whole thing. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who were those men? What had they done? And who was the guy looking for them? Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things. A car parked across the street from the truck stop that hadn't been there before. The same car I saw later that week in the parking lot of my apartment complex. It was a dark sedan, maybe a Charger or something similar. Tinted windows. I never saw who was driving it. I told myself I was being paranoid. That it was just a coincidence. But then I saw it again outside the grocery store I went to. And again parked on my street when I came home from work. Someone was following me. I pulled out the business card and called the number. It rang 3 times before someone answered. Yeah, a man's voice said. It was the guy from the truck stop. This is Alex, I said. From the truck stop. You gave me your card. I remember. Someone's following me. There's a car that keeps showing up wherever I go. I think it might be those guys you were asking about. There was a pause. What kind of car? I described it as best I could. Another pause. That's not them, he said finally. That's someone else. Who? Someone you don't want to mess with. Listen to me carefully. You need to leave. Tonight. Pack a bag and drive somewhere else. Stay with family or friends. Somewhere those men wouldn't know to look for you. What? Why? What the hell is going on? I can't explain everything right now. But you need to trust me. Leave tonight. Don't tell anyone where you're going. And keep that number. Call me when you're somewhere safe. He hung up. I stood there in my apartment, phone still in my hand, trying to process what I'd just heard. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think I was in actual danger. But something in that man's voice made me believe him. I packed a bag. Threw in some clothes, my laptop, important documents. I got in my car and drove 3 hours to my parents' house without telling them I was coming. When I got there, it was almost 2 a.m. I knocked on the door and my dad answered, confused and worried. I told him I needed to stay for a few days. That I'd explain in the morning. He didn't ask questions. I stayed there for 2 weeks. Called my manager at the truck stop and quit over the phone, said I had a family emergency. I didn't go back to my apartment for a month. When I finally did, everything seemed normal. No car following me. No strange people hanging around. I called the number on the business card one more time to tell him I was back. You should be fine now, he said. They've moved on. Who were they? I asked. Please. I need to know. He sighed. The older guy you met at your first job? He was trafficking people. Young people, mostly. Runaways, college kids who wouldn't be missed right away. His nephew was his partner. They'd scope out potential targets, find out their routines, where they lived. then they'd grab them. I felt sick. And the car that was following me? Associates. They thought you might know where the older guy was hiding. After I showed up asking questions, they figured you might be involved somehow. You weren't, obviously, but they needed to make sure. Are they in jail now? The older guy and his partner? They're not your problem anymore, he said. That was all he'd say. He hung up and I never heard from him again. I think about that older guy sometimes. How he came into the gas station, asked me all those questions, brought his partner to look at me. How close I came to being one of his victims. I got lucky. I quit before anything could happen. But it still haunts me. Knowing what he was doing. Knowing I was probably on his list. I've never worked a late-night gas station shift again. I can't. Every time I see someone walk in late at night, I think about him. And I wonder who he was targeting. And if they got away like I did. Story 3, the truck bed. This happened about 2 years ago. I was working as a contractor at the time, doing construction work on various job sites around the state. The night in question, I was heading back from a job site about 4 hours from my house. I was exhausted. The job had taken way longer than expected, and I'd been working for 12 straight hours. By the time I got back on the road, it was already past 9 p.m. I know a 4-hour drive doesn't sound too intense, but I had been working so hard that even the simple task of keeping my eyes open was a chore. Plus, my truck is several years old. I don't drive a fancy vehicle with assisted driving or anything like that. So, it's not like I had the comfort of knowing my car would help keep me alert. About an hour in, I knew I needed to stop. My eyelids were doing that thing where they just kind of drift down on their own, and I was having to physically shake my head to stay alert. So, I pulled into the next gas station off the highway. It was around 10 o'clock at that point. The place was one of those standalone stations, not connected to a bigger truck stop or anything. Just a small building with a few pumps outside. I filled up my tank, smoked a cigarette, and kind of stood there debating what to do. I still had over 3 hours of driving ahead of me, and I knew there was no way I'd make it. So, I made the decision to take a quick nap in my truck and finish the drive afterward. I drove to the corner of the parking lot, away from the pumps and the building, and turned my engine off. I was just going to sleep for a couple hours right there. I've slept in worse places. It didn't seem like a big deal. I reclined my seat back as far as it would go and closed my eyes. I was out almost instantly. When my alarm went off 2 hours later, it felt like I had blinked and time had passed. I still wasn't fully rested, but I was definitely more alert than before, which was good enough for me. The parking lot was mostly empty now. There had been at least 3 other vehicles there when I pulled in, and they were all gone. Just my truck and one other car parked near the building. Without as much as a second thought, I started my truck and pulled back onto the highway. Things were fine for maybe the first 30 minutes. The highway was dead and I was kind of zoning out. Not falling asleep per se, but just letting muscle memory take over. I was essentially on autopilot. At one point, I realized my truck was making some strange noises. It actually took my brain a few minutes to process what I was hearing as abnormal. That's how zoned out I was. I turned the radio down so I could hear things more clearly. There was this faint thumping sound coming from somewhere behind me, like something was shifting around. I glanced in my rearview mirror, but I couldn't see anything. The back window of my truck has a tinted cover, so visibility into the truck bed is limited from inside the cab. I turned around a few times, looking through the small rear window, but didn't see any loose items bouncing around or anything like that. I figured it was just something shifting around in the truck bed. One of my tools, maybe some equipment. Beyond speculating, there wasn't much else I could do. The situation didn't really warrant me pulling over immediately, so I made a mental note to check it when I got home, and I kept driving. The sounds continued, though. It actually started to bother me, and I ended up cranking the radio to drown it out. At one point, I slammed my hand against the dashboard out of frustration. Damn it, I muttered to myself. Strangely, that seemed to work. For maybe 15 minutes after that, things were quiet. I was relieved, not because the noise was worrying me, but because it was genuinely annoying. The adrenaline from getting so worked up had woken me up a bit more, which was a good thing. But that increased alertness also cleared some of the brain fog, and I started thinking about how odd it was for a sound being made by an inanimate object to stop so abruptly as a result of my outburst. I had already eliminated the possibility that a faulty part in my truck had been making the sound. The truck was old, sure, but I kept it maintained. So, the fact that slapping the dashboard could have caused a mechanical sound to stop was such a weird coincidence. I was in my head about it, debating whether I should pull over and check the bed, when out of nowhere, I heard a deafening bang come from directly behind me. It wasn't a normal sound. It was loud, violent, like metal hitting metal. Like someone had swung a hammer against the back of my cab. The next few seconds were pure chaos and terror. I jerked forward in my seat and looked in the rearview mirror. Through the small back window, I could see movement in the truck bed. There was a person back there. A person. Standing up in my truck bed. My heart nearly stopped. I swerved slightly out of shock, then tried to regain control of the truck. I looked in the mirror again. The person was still there, now crouched down, holding something in their hands. It looked like one of my tools. A wrench or a pry bar. They started hitting the back window of the cab with it. The glass didn't break, but it cracked. They hit it again. More cracks spread across the glass. What the fuck? I yelled, my voice cracking. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't pull over. If I pulled over, this person would have easy access to me. But I couldn't keep driving with them back there trying to break into the cab. I made a split-second decision. I slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a halt and the person in the back flew forward, hitting the back of the cab hard. I heard them grunt in pain. I threw the truck into park, grabbed my phone, and jumped out of the driver's seat. I ran around to the back of the truck, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. When I got to the truck bed, the person was climbing out. They jumped down onto the highway and started running. It was a man, probably in his 30s, wearing a dirty hoodie and jeans. He was limping slightly as he ran toward the tree line on the side of the highway. I stood there for a moment, too shocked to move. Then my survival instincts kicked in and I realized standing on a dark highway in the middle of nowhere was probably not the smartest thing to do. I climbed into the truck bed to see what damage had been done. The back window was cracked in multiple places. One more good hit and it would have shattered completely. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. In the corner of the truck bed, partially hidden under a tarp I kept back there, was a bag. A duffel bag. It wasn't mine. I pulled the tarp back and looked at the bag more closely. It was dirty, stained with something dark. It smelled terrible, like rotting garbage mixed with something metallic. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't even want to be near it. But I needed to know what was in it. I used a tool to unzip it slightly, just enough to see inside. I wish I hadn't. Inside the bag were clothes. Men's clothes. A shirt, jeans, shoes. All of them covered in dark stains. Blood stains. I stepped back from the truck bed, my hands shaking. I pulled out my phone and called 911. The dispatcher asked me what my emergency was and I tried to explain. There was someone hiding in my truck bed. They tried to break into the cab. They left a bag. There's blood on the clothes inside. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and gave me instructions to pull over to a safe location and wait for police. I got back in my truck and drove to the next exit, which was maybe 5 miles up the highway. There was a rest stop there. I parked under the lights and waited. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. 2 officers. I told them everything that had happened. They examined the bag in my truck bed. They put on gloves and opened it fully, documenting everything inside. One of the officers asked me if I'd stopped anywhere on my drive. I told him about the gas station where I'd taken a nap. He probably climbed in while you were asleep, the officer said. You don't have a bed cover, so it would have been easy. But why? I asked. Why would someone hide in my truck? The officer exchanged a look with his partner. We'll need to take this bag in as evidence. It's possible this person was fleeing from something. Or someone. The blood on these clothes could be evidence of a crime. They asked me more questions. What the person looked like, which direction they ran, how long I'd been at the gas station. I answered everything as best I could, but my mind was racing. What had this person done? Why were they hiding in my truck? And what would have happened if they'd gotten through that window? The officers eventually let me go. They told me they'd be in touch and that I should get the back window fixed as soon as possible. I drove home in a daze. I couldn't stop thinking about the person in my truck bed. About how close they'd been to getting into the cab with me. About the bag with the bloody clothes. I never heard from the police again. I don't know if they ever caught the person or if they figured out whose blood was on those clothes. I got the window fixed the next day and tried to move on. But I've never taken a nap at a gas station again. I've never parked my truck without checking the bed first. Because I'll never forget the sound of that tool hitting the glass. The sight of that person standing in my truck bed, trying to break their way in. And I'll never forget that bag. And the blood.